Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode, whether you are an existing 10 to Lifer or brand new and checking out the channel for the first time. I appreciate having you here. So let me talk to you a little bit about the case we'll be discussing today. It has to do with secrecy. Of course, it has to do with crimes, things like that. And I just want to set the tone. I feel like all of us have secrets, right? Don't go looking for mine, but like all of us have secrets. Even somebody who you think is the most honest person in the world probably has some secret. Maybe it's a smaller one, like they think their best friend's laugh is annoying and they just keep that to themselves because they don't want to hurt their feelings. But I feel like all of us just have secrets, whether they're low stakes or high stakes. Some people even have huge secrets, affairs, obsessions, violent crimes, I mean, you name it. And that's one of the most interesting things about today's case. It's a very gruesome murder, yes, but every single person who was involved had a very big secret. And the key to solving this gruesome murder wasn't about finding out who was lying and who was telling the truth. No. The police were able to cut through all of the noise to see which secrets ended up being worth killing over. So we are going to go right into this case, but be warned, you're going to be with me for a minute because it's got a lot of twists and turns. It's a longer one, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about. So guys, let's jump right in. Latrese Curtis was born on May 28, 1986. When she was growing up, she was extremely close to her entire family, including her parents, Sherman and Cynthia Jones, and her 4 siblings. She also had a ton of friends. I mean, right from the get-go, Latrice was just a people person. She was outgoing, she was popular all the way through high school, and she was the sort of person who could just walk into a room that was full of strangers that she didn't know and just strike up a conversation. It was no big deal to her. It was easy. Then, by the time she was ready to go, she would have everybody's phone number. She had all of these relationships built. I mean, it just came easily to her. She was also a bit of a tomboy and a daddy's girl. She followed her dad, Sherman, around everywhere he went. They went fishing together, they played basketball, and more importantly, Latrice knew that she could tell her dad anything. It didn't matter how scary or tough the situation was, he was there, at her side, every step of the way. Basically, they had the ideal father-daughter relationship. There was complete trust and there was mutual respect. But by the time that Latrice was in middle school, her interests, they changed. I mean, all of a sudden, this former tomboy was into like everything girly. Now Latrice loved getting her hair and nails done. She became super interested in fashion, everything. Now, even though her interests were moving in a new direction, her relationship with her dad and her relationship with the rest of her family never changed. They were still as close as ever. Even when she graduated from high school and needed to pick out a college, Latrice was committed to just staying close by. She wanted to be near her relatives. So she ended up being accepted at Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, and that's where she decided she was going to major in accounting. Now, Greensboro was a fairly busy city. It was full of restaurants, clubs, and museums, and it was spread out over more than 100 square miles, but for somebody like Latrice, who was so good at adapting in any situation and making friends everywhere she went, it seemed like it was a pretty good fit. So sure enough, she met someone very important when she was in college. His name was Darin Curtis. He served in Iraq in 2004 as part of the Army National Guard, and now he had the exact same major as Latrice, accounting. As soon as they met, Latrice and Darin, they hit it off. They went on a few dates, and then pretty quickly their relationship became serious. And Darin was Latrice's first real boyfriend, which was obviously a huge deal. And usually when somebody starts dating a person who they're like really excited about, they tell everybody. They scream it from the rooftops. Nowadays, they do like a hard launch on Instagram. You know how it is. You're like hopping on the phone with your parents, your friends, your brother, your sister, everybody. You just want to gush about this awesome person who's in your life. And I feel like a lot of the times, it's not even that you're trying to. It's just you work their name into every sentence naturally. Like you want to share about this person. But for whatever reason, Latrice didn't tell anybody about Darin. It was almost like she was keeping their relationship a secret. Now, in fairness, this was the early 2000s, and social media wasn't anything like it is now. It definitely was not a situation where she could just update her Facebook status or post on Insta and notify hundreds or thousands of people all at once. And even if that had been an option, honestly, I don't know if Latrice would have done it because she was pretty private about her personal life, which is totally her right. I mean, she didn't have to tell anybody that she was dating somebody new. It was just a little weird that she even kept her big news from her family, somebody who she always told everything to, and they were so close, and it just didn't seem right. It seemed a little off. It would be one thing if she was just waiting for a few weeks maybe, make sure that what she had with Darin was real, that it wasn't some fleeting fling, gosh, that's a mouthful. But what I mean by that is I don't think that it would be weird if one day Latrice were to say hey, by the way, I've been dating this guy for a month or two, but I didn't want to tell you about him because I didn't know what it was. I mean, that would be fine. But that's not what happened here. Latrice kept him a secret for an entire year, an entire 365 days. And it wasn't just her family. She also never mentioned Darin to her close friends or anybody that she worked with. Literally, the first time that anybody even got a hint that she was seeing him was when they got married. I mean, I have no words. It's one thing to want to keep your life private, or your private life private, I should say, but this went way beyond that. I mean, having a whole wedding without ever even mentioning the existence of your significant other, that's a pretty conscious choice and has a lot of meaning behind it to me. And I have to imagine that it took some work to keep Darin a secret for a whole year too. I mean, they never went out in public where one of Latrice's friends could spot them. If anybody ever asked about her weekend plans, she would never slip up and say, hey, I'm seeing my boyfriend. There was a lot of effort here. And again, there's deciding not to mention something that is nobody's business, and then there's going to extreme lengths to keep such a big part of your life a secret. And it makes me wonder why it was so important for Latrice to hide Darin. Maybe she was embarrassed for some reason? And Darin was apparently on board with this too. Otherwise, at some point, you would think that he was asking why they had to keep sneaking around. Why hasn't he met any of her friends or family? So anyway, after the wedding, Latrice just showed up at her job at Sears one day, and she had a giant ring on her finger. And she said, hey, I got married. And they literally thought that she was joking. So there was actually a little bit of back and forth before Latrice could convince anyone that she had been dating somebody this whole time and she now had a husband. People weren't believing her. It was really weird because pretty much right up until that moment, all of Latrice's coworkers thought that they were all very close. They hung out after work, they talked about their lives, and it didn't make any sense for her to keep something like that quiet. But after that, she did start letting people get a peek at her personal life. She had her work friends meet Darin, and he came across as fairly nice and respectful. There didn't seem to be anything really notable about him. He was just an average guy. I mean, certainly nothing worth hiding from anybody. Then Latrice's family found out that she was married. She invited her parents and her siblings to meet Darin, just like her coworkers had. But it did not go well. Not because of anything specific that Darin did or said, but more the whole situation was just not good from the start. I mean, before they even shook Darin's hand, Latrice's mom and dad were just super hurt and even a little bit suspicious and kind of even a little bit mad at him. They even told Latrice that they didn't understand why she would do something like that. She was so close with her whole family, especially her dad, Sherman. Now, he in particular was wondering if maybe something had happened to make her think that she couldn't trust him anymore, or if maybe they just weren't as close as he thought they were. He was really just trying to make sense of all of it. So Latrice tried to reassure everyone. She said that the secret wasn't actually a sign that anything was bad. She still loved her parents and trusted them, and she said that her relationship with Darin was really strong and happy and good. He was a great guy. There was nothing to worry about and nothing to read into regarding the situation. Except that almost made it worse, because then the thinking was, okay, well, if everything is so good, why not just tell us what's going on? Now, on top of the weirdness around the surprise wedding, Sherman also had some very traditional values. He believed that if a man wanted to propose to a woman, he had to ask her father's blessing first. So not only was Darin's whole existence a shock, but he and Latrice went ahead and got married without ever asking for Sherman's go-ahead. So Sherman thought that it was hugely disrespectful on Darin's part. So this was one more factor to make their whole first meeting just kind of get off on completely the wrong foot. And even though Latrice tried to tell everybody that she still loved her family and trusted them, her dad Sherman didn't know if he could trust her. If she kept something this huge from him, what else was she hiding? So after that disastrous meeting, Sherman mostly kept his distance from his daughter and her new husband. It made him too upset to sit and make small talk, pretending like everything was normal between them. Now, before I move on, I do want to note that for Latrice's part, she said that she had a very good reason to keep her dating life private. She told some other people in her family that Sherman was a little too protective at times. She thought that if he knew that she was in a more serious relationship, he might take the news badly. Of course, nobody knows what anyone else's family situation is like, and I'm not sure what exactly Latrice thought was going to happen when her dad, Sherman, found out. And keeping a whole year-long relationship secret, including an engagement and a wedding, that feels like an extreme step to me. But I trust that Latrice knew her own situation better than any outside person ever could. And she had her reasons to keep it to herself, and she had the right to decide what she was comfortable sharing and what she wanted to keep close to the chest. So I'm not going to lie and pretend this whole situation wasn't super weird, but people do have the right to privacy and to be weird if that's what you call it. Nobody, not even your parents, is entitled to any personal information that you aren't comfortable sharing. So even though Latrice's dad was keeping his distance, she and Darin tried to keep moving forward with life like normal. They both decided to transfer to North Carolina Central University, which was in Durham, North Carolina, and they both wanted to finish their degrees there. Now, Durham was about an hour's drive from Greensboro, so this wasn't a major move on their part. It was also a pretty big city and home to 2 large universities. So Latrice and Darin still had lots of opportunities to go out, socialize, sightsee even, and do all the same things that they had enjoyed doing back in Greensboro. Not that they had a ton of free time to go to parties or explore, though, because Latrice was working part-time and going to school full-time. She was also navigating the newlywed life and trying to fix things with her family as much as she could. By early 2008, her relationship with her parents still wasn't great, though. But on the upside, she only had 1 semester left to get her degree and to then be able to move on to the next stage of her life. So that was her headspace on January 29th, 2008. That day started out like normal. Latrice went to class and Darin went about his business. Most days she would call Darin when she was leaving campus so that he would know when to expect her home. Around 10 p.m., Latrice reached out to say that she was on her way. She was going to grab something to eat and then head back to the apartment right after. Darin figured that it wouldn't take any longer than 30 minutes, maybe an hour at most, so he got ready for bed without waiting up for her. But an hour went by and Latrice didn't come back. And then that hour became 2 hours, then 3. So by this point, it was the middle of the night. Not only was Latrice still not home, but she also hadn't called Darin to explain what the holdup was. But Darin waited until the next morning, 8:30 a.m. to be exact, until he called 911 and filed a missing persons report. Now at this point, all he could think was that maybe something had happened to Latrice after she left campus. She could have been in a terrible car accident, or maybe her car broke down somewhere with no service, so she wasn't able to call anybody for help. He hated the thought that Latrice had been stranded all night waiting for somebody to notice her. Except it turns out that a bunch of people had noticed her, and in the worst possible way. All night long, a bunch of different people called 911. And they all told dispatchers the exact same thing. While they were driving along Interstate 540, they saw something that looked like a dead body on the side of the road. The first person who called 911 that night did so around 5 or 6 a.m.
I'm on 550 westbound, just past, I believe, the Buffalo exit, about a mile before 401, and I think there's a body on the side of the road.
A little while later, another caller told the operator, "I think there's like something laying on the side of the highway. There's a car pulled over. I just pulled over and said, let me call the police and let them just drive by and check." So the police headed over to that area where the 2 callers had described, and that's when they found the body of 21-year-old Latrese Curtis.
Someone called 911 during rush hour saying they saw a body on the side of 540. The scene is near Highway 401. All day, police would only say the victim is a woman. We just learned who she is. Amanda Lamb is live now with the new details. Amanda.
Pam, just a few minutes ago, we learned from investigators here at the Wake County Sheriff's Office that the victim is 21-year-old Latrese Curtis of Raleigh. Now, we understand she was a student at NC Central, and she was the same woman reported missing to the Durham police by her husband this morning.
Now, unfortunately, Latrice's death was not quick and it was not painless. And even though her body was found at the side of the road, she clearly did not die in any sort of accident. Somebody had stabbed her many, many times. There were so many wounds that the police weren't even able to count all of them. However, later on, her autopsy results said that she was stabbed around 40 times in the head, neck, chest, and stomach. Latrice's pants were unzipped and unbuttoned. And in another detail, which the police didn't receive until after they got the autopsy report, there was a condom inside of her. And I know what you're probably thinking. Between the condom and the unbuttoned pants, it sounds like Latrice might have been killed in a sexual crime. But there was no evidence of a sexual assault. So I'm not sure if at this point the police figured that she was having a consensual affair that maybe turned violent later. It's hard to imagine what other theories they could even come up with at this point. But the point is of all of this, it was just super weird. And her car was near her body on the side of I-540. It had blood inside, some of which matched Latrice's DNA, but the rest of the blood came from somebody else. The police ran it through their computers, but they didn't make a match right away. They figured that the blood had to belong to Latrice's killer, and whoever they weren't in the system yet. The detectives also found Latrice's cell phone, even though it was a few hundred feet away from her body. It had been sitting out overnight in the rain, so unfortunately it was pretty badly damaged. But the detectives did figure out that someone had turned it off the night before. So their thinking was that somebody killed Latrice, turned off her phone, and then dropped it. Now, as for how it ended up so far away from the rest of the scene, one theory was that Latrice's killer had it in their car. Maybe they started to drive away and they noticed that the phone was still with them, so they just, chucked it out of the window. And I know this is all a little bit confusing, so I'm going to just kind of lay this out for you again to make sure everything is super clear. Latrice's body was on the side of the road. She was stabbed to death. Her car was nearby, and then her phone was pretty far away from that. The location of the phone suggested that her killer had driven away, and they didn't walk. They had a vehicle. So that meant that there were two vehicles involved in this crime. Latrice's, which was still at the scene, and the escape car, which was presumably with the killer. But the question is, why did Latrice get out of her car in order to get stabbed at the side of the road? Like, did the killer somehow find a way to get her to pull over so that they could hurt her, they could attack her? Or did Latrice stop on her own, and then somebody saw her standing there and took this opportunity to attack, a crime of opportunity? If Latrice did decide to stop, well, it's hard to say why she would, because there wasn't anything around, and she would have been driving pretty late at night too. So needless to say, the police had lots of questions, and not much in the way of answers, I'll be honest. Keep in mind that the detectives hadn't even identified Latrice yet. They found her body at around 5 or 6 in the morning. This was a few hours before Darin reported her missing, and since her phone wouldn't turn on, they didn't have any way of figuring out who she was, so they were basically starting from zero. So when Darin called 911, he actually helped move the investigation forward in a pretty big way, because the moment the detectives heard his description of what Latrice looked like, and when he added in that key detail that she was driving down I-540, the police realized that this woman had to be his wife.
My wife goes to school out at North Carolina Central, and she did not come home last night. I talked to her last night. She was on her way home. She was in the car and everything. She hadn't showed up since.
So naturally, once they knew who Latrice was, the police had some questions about why Darin waited so long to report her missing. You would think that he would have called 911 much, much earlier, at least by midnight maybe the night before. They figured he might have stayed quiet because he had something to do with the murder. And if he killed Latrice himself, maybe he wanted to buy a few hours before calling it in. Why else would he stay quiet? And as it turned out, Darin was keeping a pretty major secret. But it wasn't the one that police thought. See, that morning, Latrice's parents had turned on the morning news, just like they did every single day. And the first thing that Latrice's dad, Sherman, saw was a headline about how a body had been found at the side of the freeway. Now, the reporters weren't saying whose body it was yet. There was nothing about the news story to make Latrice's parents think that it had anything to do with her. But even though it maybe wasn't rational, Sherman, her dad, had this sudden feeling in his gut that something wasn't right. He had an impulse to call Latrice and just make sure that she was okay, which was a little weird because he and Latrice were still arguing about the surprise wedding, and they weren't in a place where Sherman would normally feel comfortable just calling her up out of the blue, but still, he felt something in his gut, and his need to talk to her was so powerful, so irresistible that he dialed her number anyway. However, he went straight to voicemail. Now, that wasn't totally unexpected. Latrice was mad at him. She might have been screening his calls, sure, but for whatever reason, her dad Sherman decided to call Darin next, and that call went to voicemail too. Now, one part of Sherman's mind was telling him that it was way too early to panic. He didn't know for sure that this could be his daughter, Latrice. Darin and Latrice, they were busy people. They could have both been in class. Maybe that's why they weren't answering their phone. But he knew that he was not going to feel better until he actually heard Latrice's voice. So Sherman dialed the number for her school. Now, I'm not sure how this next part happened. The police hadn't publicly announced that Latrice was the body on the road yet. They definitely hadn't notified her parents. But somehow, the rumor mill, it was churning, and all of this gossip was flying around. The university's staff found out that Latrice was dead, and that she was in fact the woman on the news. So when Sherman called, the person who answered the phone was in a super awkward position, because they didn't want to be the person to tell him that Latrice was dead. So all they said was that he needed to talk to the police department, which, the moment that Sherman heard this, it was like somebody just punched him right in the gut. There was no reason for Sherman to call the authorities unless something was incredibly wrong here. So he and his wife Cynthia headed right over to the police station, just feeling extremely anxious, very, very worried. The whole time they were both hoping that somebody had just made a horrible mistake. But sadly, as soon as they sat down with a detective, they learned that not only was Latrice dead, but she had been murdered. Sherman actually gave an interview later that day too. He talked about how eerie it was to see his daughter's body on the news before he even realized that it was her, and that she was covered under this blue tarp. I mean, honestly, what an absolute horror story. And actually, they could have learned the news much earlier, because when Sherman and Cynthia were talking to the detectives, it was after Darin had learned what happened to Latrice. He'd known the whole truth for a while now, and he hadn't said a word to her parents. See, after Darin called 911, the police asked him to come in and identify Latrice's body. He confirmed that it was her, but then he kept that information all to himself. He had an opportunity to say something when her dad Sherman called him, but instead he rejected the call. So it struck Cynthia and Sherman as just incredibly cruel for Darin to keep such huge news a secret and then force them to ask around and figure out this terrible truth for themselves. If they hadn't thought to call the university or go to the police station, who knows how long it would have taken for them to find out what had happened. Would Sherman or Cynthia have had to open the morning paper one day to see their daughter's name in the headline? I mean, this was beyond. And on top of that, the police told Sherman and Cynthia about how long it took for Darin to file the missing persons report. They agreed that the detectives were right to be suspicious. Everything about Darin was a massive red flag, from the start of his relationship with Latrice right now to the end of it. Now, in Darin's defense, he had only just learned of his wife's passing and that she was dead. So I don't think anybody handles grief well. It's painful, it's crushing, and it's possible that he wasn't trying to keep this massive news a secret. Maybe he just wasn't ready to talk to anybody, including his wife's parents. And to his credit, he did cooperate fully with the police. He let them take his fingerprints and also a DNA sample to compare with the blood that they found in Latrice's car, and he also volunteered to go in for an interrogation. That's when he explained the real reason that he hadn't reported Latrice missing earlier. Apparently, he fell asleep right after they talked on the phone, so right around after 10 p.m. He didn't realize that she never came home until his alarm went off the next morning and he saw that she wasn't in bed. Now, hearing this, I feel like I could go either way on Darin. On one hand, yeah, there is nothing weird about falling asleep late at night and then not waking up until the morning. But it didn't look great as part of the larger pattern here, with all of his other odd behavior. I also think it's really interesting that his alibi was that he was asleep, at home, alone. So it was impossible to corroborate, but also not too difficult to believe either. So basically, the police finished questioning Darin, and they didn't have anything concrete. They couldn't totally rule him out, but he also wasn't especially suspicious either. They searched Darin's car and also the apartment that he shared with Latrice because they wanted to see if they could find any sort of clues, any evidence. But everything looked pretty normal. There weren't any signs of a struggle, and there were no signs of foul play. Since they couldn't get any further with Darin, the police had to keep their minds open. They had to check around to see if there were any other potential suspects. They talked to Latrice's friends to see if she had any enemies, maybe somebody who would want to hurt her, but nobody could think of anyone. She was still really, really well liked, and she got along with pretty much everybody. So it seemed like the detectives were hitting one wall after another. That was until somebody provided a tip that changed everything. It came from State Highway Patrolman Isaac Cooper. The night that Latrice died, Isaac was patrolling I-540, where her body was eventually found. But when he drove by at around 1:30 a.m., Latrice's body wasn't there yet. Instead, he saw 2 cars pulled over on the side of the highway. One was a white Nissan Sentra, and the other was a white cargo van. So Isaac stopped to see what was going on. He figured that maybe one of the drivers had broken down and they needed help. Except when Isaac walked over to the cargo van and to the Sentra, he found both of the vehicles completely empty. Both vehicles had their keys in the ignition and the windows rolled down part of the way, which was weird because it was raining, but that was it. So Isaac didn't know what to make of it all. He wrote down both license plates, planning to do some digging when he could and figure out what was going on, but then he got sent out on a high-priority call and basically forgot all about the van and all about the Sentra. Then, when Latrice's death made the news, he recognized her car as being that exact same Sentra that he had seen the night before. So as the investigation went on, 4 other witnesses all came forward saying they saw the same thing. 2 vehicles parked on the side of the highway. The only variation in all of these tips was that some people thought that the car and the van were right next to each other, but then others said that they were on opposite sides of the interstate. So the detectives looked up the license plate numbers that Isaac gave them. The Nissan Sentra was Latrice's car, just as they suspected. As for the white cargo van, it belonged to somebody named Robert Rivas. Now, this guy had not come up at any other point during their investigation. Robert wasn't one of Latrice's friends or coworkers. He wasn't related to her. Nobody had even mentioned this guy as somebody that Latrice might have known. And as it turned out, Robert was Pastor Robert Rivas, and he worked at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. Now, Latrice was religious, but she didn't attend Robert's church, so there was nothing connecting these 2 people at all. Even though Robert was a pastor, he wasn't an angel either. He'd been preaching at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church for close to 2 decades, but his criminal record went back even further than that. In 1982, he was charged with simple assault and battery. A little while later, he was accused of sexually inappropriate behavior with a young boy in his parish, and he eventually changed jobs because of that. Eventually, those accusations triggered a police investigation, and he was convicted of 3rd-degree criminal sexual conduct. After serving his time, Robert went back to preaching, this time in New York. Nobody knew him there, and apparently they also didn't look too closely at his background. Everyone who met Robert around this time said that he was super charismatic and trustworthy, though. Well, that is until 2002, which was when more allegations came out. This time, he was charged with 1st-degree criminal sexual conduct. He also got into trouble for financial card theft, larceny, possession of a stolen vehicle, and solicitation to obtain stolen property under false pretenses. Now, nothing about this background, though, explained why Robert would want to hurt Latrice. But with a criminal history like this, the police had to, of course, treat him as a suspect. So they brought him into the station for questioning. Right away, the detectives noticed that Robert had a bunch of cuts and scratches on his hands. He had them on his legs, his hands, almost everywhere, and they looked pretty recent. And one of the cuts was on his right hand, and it was super deep. So the detectives asked him, "Hey, what are all of these cuts from?" And Robert said that he was moving a desk at his house. It had a lot of splinters and a lot of rough spots, so because of this, it cut up all of his hands. Robert also said that his roommate Stephen had helped him move the furniture in case they needed to verify his story. And as it turned out, he had a pretty easy explanation for everything. Throughout his interrogation, Robert cooperated really well. He was totally calm, cool, collected, even when they took his picture and gathered his DNA. In terms of his alibi, Robert said that on the night of Latrice's murder, he needed to be at church for an evening service. So he left his house at about 8 p.m., which is important, and I'll come back to that later. He had the service and he finished up around 10. Then he wrapped up his work for the day and he drove back home. It was maybe 11 or 11:30 by the time he got back, but Robert hadn't noted the exact timing. That said, Robert lived with 2 roommates, and he said that either one of them could corroborate his whereabouts. But then he started saying some pretty wild things. Robert claimed that he didn't know Latrice super well, but that he had seen her around occasionally because they shared a mutual friend. Specifically, Latrice was apparently having an affair with his roommate Stephen Randolph. Stephen played basketball at NCCU, the same college that Latrice went to. So it seemed safe to assume that Latrice and Stephen may have met in one of their classes or something, or maybe even met on campus. Now, as for how Stephen knew Robert, Robert said he basically let Stephen live with him, basically as an act of charity. Now, when they first met, Stephen didn't have a job and his living situation wasn't great. I'm not sure all of the details, but Robert said that Stephen could live in his basement for a dirt cheap price of $300 a month, and that was all. That was how much he had to pay for rent. So, of course, Stephen moved in, and then that's when Latrice started coming around to see him. Robert said she was actually at their house right before the murder, too. When he left to go to that church service at around 8 p.m., her car was parked out front. And Robert also said that he knew that Stephen and Latrice were having sex that night. As for how Robert's van ended up on the freeway, he insisted he never stopped there, but maybe Stephen had a key. Apparently, he had had some car troubles and someone had recently slashed his tires. So as an act of kindness, Robert let Stephen borrow his van so that he could get around. He also told Stephen to use it whenever he needed it. He didn't even have to ask him for permission. This meant it would have been really easy for Stephen to take the van out, late at night, while Robert was asleep. On top of all of that, Robert made a lot of other really alarming comments about Stephen. Among other things, Robert said that Stephen had been stockpiling a ton of weapons, including knives and swords. He also said that one day when he was in Stephen's bedroom, he found a gun under his pillow. And according to Robert, right before she died, literally just a few hours before, Latrice told Stephen that she wanted a more serious relationship. To hear Robert tell it, Stephen might have killed Latrice because she was pressuring him into a commitment that he didn't want to make. It sounded like he had the motive, the opportunity, and the means between Robert's van and all of those knives. So next, the police talked to Stephen. They wanted to get his side of the story. And while Stephen agreed with Robert in terms of the basic facts of what he shared, he had a very different viewpoint on how the past few months had played out. See, Robert had acted like he was a fatherly figure to Stephen, taking care of him in his time of need and all of these things. But Stephen said that Robert made unwanted sexual advances on him pretty soon after they moved in together. Stephen specifically said that Robert was willing to let Stephen live in his home rent-free in exchange for oral sex. And apparently this was such an over-the-top offer that Stephen thought that he was joking at first. Once he realized that Robert meant what he said, Stephen got super angry and he stormed out of the house. About 10 minutes later, he came home and he set some boundaries, namely that nothing like that would ever happen between them. So apparently Robert apologized, and then Stephen hoped that that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. In fact, Robert kept bringing it up and pressuring Stephen pretty hard for sex, which sounds extremely uncomfortable. And I think it's also worth highlighting the power difference between Stephen and Robert. Again, I don't know what his housing situation was like before this point, but it sounds like Stephen couldn't afford to move anywhere else. He might have felt like he had to put up with Robert's sexual harassment if he didn't want to end up homeless. And things got to a point where Stephen didn't feel safe or comfortable in his own place. So he eventually borrowed his cousin's gun and he kept it in his room. He hoped he would never have to use it, but he felt better knowing that it was there in case he ever needed it. On top of that, these strange things started happening in Stephen's life. Now, when I tell you about them, there was nothing concrete to prove that Robert was behind everything, but I don't think it's that hard to see why Stephen was suspicious, given everything else we know about Robert. So at one point, Stephen was dating a woman named Velma Newton. She came over sometimes, and Robert knew who she was. In late October 2007, Velma started getting very disturbing phone calls from an unknown number. The caller wasn't threatening Velma directly, but instead, he talked about all of the bad things that he would do to Steven. He said that he would break both of Steven's legs so that he couldn't play basketball anymore. And he told Velma the only way to save her boyfriend was if she told him to, quote, stop doing whatever he is doing. Then, the caller started reaching out to Steven too. He said he hoped Steven had a gun, which was way too weird and scary to be a coincidence. He was saying this literally right after Steven got that gun from his cousin. So after that conversation, Steven was shaken, and he went right home to check on the gun. And when he did, it was missing. Later, he confronted Robert, who admitted that he took it. Just a few weeks after that, Steven got a flat tire. He didn't immediately connect it to the threatening calls, he just headed over to a gas station to fix it. But then, the second he got to Velma's place later that day, calls started pouring in again, almost like somebody was watching him and tracking his movements, so they knew the exact second that he would be available to answer these phone calls. And sure enough, when he wanted to head home again that night, he found that all 4 of his tires had been slashed. That evening, Steven decided to stay at Velma's because he didn't feel safe at home with Robert, especially knowing that Robert still had his gun. But for the entire rest of the night, Robert kept calling, practically begging him to come home. Then he started acting like he was the one who was scared. Robert said that there was some stranger knocking on the front door and ringing the doorbell repeatedly. So basically, he acted like he wanted Steven to come home and protect him. But Steven was like, no, absolutely not. The next month, during Christmas break of 2007, Steven went out of town to visit his family in Baltimore. While he was gone, Velma got yet another disturbing phone call. This time, the unknown caller told her that he had slashed all 4 of her tires and that he was sorry. And when Velma went outside to check on her car, sure enough, her tires were slashed. So clearly somebody was obsessed with Steven and Velma, and the evidence was all pointing to Robert. But even though the behavior seemed to be getting worse and worse, Steven refused to be intimidated into letting Robert control his romantic life. So he even started dating somebody new. Latrice. So yeah, that part of Robert's testimony was true. Latrice really was cheating on her husband Darin with Steven. Steven knew that Latrice was married, but apparently that wasn't a big deal breaker for him. I mean, obviously Steven and Latrice weren't exclusive. Latrice was still with Darin, and Steven was still seeing Velma on the side too. And Robert knew about all of this, because in case it isn't obvious from everything that I've shared already, Robert was constantly watching Steven. He kept tabs on every single woman that Steven saw, including Latrice. Not that Latrice and Steven were doing a great job of hiding their relationship. Steven had only been living with Robert for a few weeks before Latrice started dropping by. I'm not sure if that means that the affair started around that time or if maybe they had been seeing each other for a while before then, but the key point here is that Robert knew about Latrice. And for him, he saw her as an obstacle. She was standing in the way, stopping Robert from being with Steven, at least in his way of thinking. So on the evening of January 29th, 2008, the same night that she was murdered, Latrice was over at Steven's place. And this matched what Robert said, that he saw her car parked out front at 8 p.m. But a lot of the other details really didn't add up. Robert said he got home from church at 11 or 11:30 and then stayed in for the rest of the night, so he couldn't have committed the murders. But Robert and Steven had a third roommate, and she said that she fell asleep sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., and she had not heard Robert come in before then. She did confirm, though, that Latrice and Steven were around for the first part of the evening. They were having sex, and according to Steven, the condom came off while they were having sex, and it got stuck inside of Latrice. Now, Steven was pretty upset about this. I'm not sure if Latrice was on any other kind of birth control or if they were worried that she might get pregnant, but Latrice left pretty soon afterward, before she could even get cleaned up. And Steven decided to take his mind off things by calling another friend. Then he and that friend decided to go over to Velma's house. This was around 10 p.m., so right around the time that Latrice called Darin and lied, saying that she was now leaving campus and on her way home. While Steven was at Velma's, Latrice called him, presumably from the road. She said she was sick of sneaking around, sick of cheating. She wanted them to have a real relationship. Now, Steven knew that Latrice was married, and he was literally at another woman's house, so, it was pretty likely that he wasn't interested in making a commitment right then and there. So he said, you know what, let's just talk about it in person. and that's the last time that he ever spoke to Latrice. But it wasn't the last time that she ever called him. A little bit later, his phone rang again, and her name came up on the caller ID. But when Stephen answered, he didn't hear anyone, just silence. He figured that maybe it was a butt dial, an accidental dial, so he hung up and he didn't think anything of it. He wasn't the only one, though, who got a call like that during the night. At around 2 a.m., Latrice's phone dialed her best friend, Kimberly Parker. It was late enough that Kimberly's first thought was that something had to be wrong. I mean, Latrice wouldn't be calling to chat that late at night. But when she answered, nobody was there. Now, I don't mean that the line was dead. She could hear traffic. She could hear wind. It sounded like someone had called her from the side of the road, but that they weren't saying anything. Kimberly also heard some footsteps in this call. And when the call ended, she called Latrice back. But she said that the call went straight to voicemail, like Latrice's phone had been turned off or something, which we know by now it had been turned off. So back to Stephen. He was at Velma's until around 1:30 a.m. He went home and he noticed that Robert's van was not parked in the driveway, which was kind of odd given how late it was. But Stephen also figured that it was none of his business. Not to mention, I've got to assume that he was kind of relieved to know that his creepy roommate wasn't home. I mean, I know I would feel a lot better walking into my house if I had a confrontation with this guy who just was nonstop harassing me for months, and if they weren't there finally. So Stephen went inside, and we know it was Stephen because the house had a high-tech security system. To unlock it, he had to type in a personal code, and Stephen's code was different from Robert's, and it was also different from the other roommates. As for Robert, he used the master code to disarm the security system at 2:30 a.m. that night. And he was the only one who knew the master code, so it was pretty clear that he was out of the house when Latrice was murdered. So Robert's testimony was all about how Stephen was probably guilty, but Stephen made it sound like Robert was a super scary, violent guy who had plenty of opportunity to hurt Latrice. The evidence did seem to be pointing toward Robert a lot more than Stephen, but the police couldn't totally write either one of them off, not just yet, at least not until they got the DNA results. Robert's sample was an extremely close match with the blood that was found in Latrice's car. I mean, they were so close that the expert said that there was a 1 in 147,000 chance of anyone else in the state fitting that profile. So I think it's safe to say it was definitely Robert's blood. So now the police had a theory. Robert was possessive, and he hated that Stephen was dating all of these other women instead of him. So after Latrice left their house that night, he followed her down the interstate. Now, you'd think that if she had just stayed in her car, Latrice could have gotten home safely. I can't imagine that Robert would have tried anything if Latrice was parked in front of her house. I mean, she could have screamed for help, and someone like, I don't know, her husband Darin could have run out and saved her. But as the theory goes, Latrice was feeling a lot of physical discomfort because that condom was still stuck inside of her. She wanted to remove it, and I guess she didn't want to wait until she got home. Maybe she was worried that Darin would catch her and have some pointed questions, thinking like, hey, why are you having an affair? Why is there a condom coming out? Or why is there a condom in the trash can? Or maybe it was another feeling of just like, I can't take another second of this. It's super uncomfortable, that kind of thing. So either way, she pulled over on the side of the road. So the theory is that's why her pants were unbuttoned. That's why her pants were unzipped. And that also explains how Robert managed to get her outside of her car. He didn't need anything to convince her to come out. She had pulled over on her own. And that's when Robert attacked. Latrice tried to fight him off, and she managed to make those 2 phone calls to Stephen and Kimberly, but she never had a chance to say anything or ask them for help. Instead, Robert got his hands on her phone, turned it off, and then killed her. So from there, it was a simple matter of just tossing the phone out the window. He may have swung by the church to clean up so that his roommates wouldn't see that he was covered in blood when he got home, and then he headed home. But he couldn't get rid of all of the evidence, namely the blood that was soaked through his clothes. So when the detectives searched Robert's home, they found one of his outfits stained with blood, and it was in a trash can. And it's a good thing that they got the warrant when they did, because if Robert had just another day or 2, he probably would have burned the evidence. But that discovery was enough for the police to arrest Robert on the morning of February 2nd. They told Latrice's family that they had the killer in custody. But when Latrice's parents heard that the police had arrested somebody named Pastor Robert, they were super confused. They had never heard of this guy before. It made no sense. So the police explained everything. And within a few days, they also confirmed that Robert was the unknown caller who had been harassing Velma and Stephen, which I think it's safe to say, no surprises there, right? Apparently, in addition to his landline and his main cell phone, Robert had another phone, and he referred to this as his fun phone. Once again, we see secrets being a real theme in this story. Nobody but Robert knew about this fun phone, knew that it even existed. So the police went through his logs, and they saw all of the times that Robert dialed Stephen and Velma's numbers. This included 7 times to Stephen on the day that his tires got slashed, and twice to Velma when her tires were slashed. But wildly, even with all of the DNA evidence, the eyewitness accounts, the phone logs, all of the evidence against Robert, his friends and coworkers refused to believe that he was capable of killing anybody. And one local minister, somebody who had worked with Robert for over 3 years, made a public statement. In this statement, he said, "Robert is an awesome man of God. He knows the Bible, knows people, a very classy gentleman. It's not his character, it's just not him. I really think he was set up." And Robert's cousin told the media he was energetic, he's a go-getter. Like I said, he was just not a murderer. Now, those statements didn't age well because once Robert went to trial beginning on September 29th, 2009, a bunch of people testified against him, including Stephen and Velma and that state highway patrolman who shared that tip about the white van in the first place. Then, a medical examiner talked about the extent of Latrice's injuries. Now, a lot of these details weren't public before this point, so the world learned for the first time that Latrice wasn't just stabbed. Her killer also left her with extreme blunt force trauma, and she also had a lot of defensive wounds, like she tried to fight off her murderer.
Under blunt force injuries, a 0.3 times 0.7 inch subgaleal hemorrhage. Subgaleal hemorrhage is the underside of the scalp. When we do the autopsy, at one point we actually invert the scalp. We cut along the scalp and turn it inside out and look for any bruising or bleeding in the scalp. So a subgaleal hemorrhage is when we turn the scalp inside out, we see the hemorrhage is consistent with a bruise or a blunt force injury. Subgaleal hemorrhage is present over the posterior aspect of the right parietal bone and adjacent occipital bone. Basically, if you were to take your hand and place it behind your ear on the back of your head, that is the area I'm talking about, the back of the right parietal and occipital bones. On the bilateral mid-back, 2 areas of abraded contusion. Contusion is a bruise, abraded is a scratching or a scrape. So we have an area of bruising with scraping on top of it. On the back, the right and the left mid-back. They're present and they measure 5.4 inches on the left and 4.3 inches on the right. On the right upper chest shoulder area, so the front of the chest, right shoulder, there is an area of abraded contusion which measures 1.5 times 2 inches. And then on the left hand, the 3rd and 5th fingernails are broken.
The defense tried to argue that Robert couldn't have hurt her this way because he had a disability from when he was mugged and stabbed in the arm while he was living in New York. This made it very difficult for Robert to do anything physical. He definitely could not have overpowered Latrice. Robert's sister added that he could barely move his left hand, let alone stab anybody.
Does Mr. Reeves have a handicap?
Yes.
What is it?
His left hand.
What is it with his left hand?
To me, it looked like it's half paralyzed.
It looks like what?
It's half paralyzed.
Do you know?
It's half paralyzed.
Okay.
Do you know how that happened?
From what I understand, he got mugged in New York.
Yeah.
And I believe he got stabbed in that arm.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to take a vein from his leg and put it in that arm.
And do you know that he has trouble using that arm and hand?
Yes.
Have you seen what he can do?
Yes.
What would you say the limits are on that left hand and arm?
Very minimal.
He can't do much?
No, not really.
Like, what kind of things?
If it's like carrying paper or stuff, he can carry that much.
Mm-hmm.
But if as far as anything else heavy, no.
Can't carry anything heavy?
No.
Does he have any good grip?
No. Normally, if you see him, he's walking with it either in his pocket or he have it down.
The testimony like this went on for 7 days, but on October 7th, 2009, the jurors went off to deliberate. When they came back, they found Robert guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Mr. Hayslip, you have signed this verdict sheet that reads as follows: we, the jury, by unanimous verdict, find the defendant, Robert Lee Adams Reeves, to be guilty of murder in the first degree. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, your foreman has announced that it was the unanimous verdict of the jury that the defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree. If that was the unanimous verdict of the jury and your individual verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree, would you indicate that by raising your hand, please? Let the record show that all 12 jurors so indicated. The court accepts the verdict and orders that it be recorded.
Latrice's family was more than happy to see Robert go away forever because they still can't get over how senseless this murder was. As near as anyone could tell, Latrice didn't even know about Robert's obsession with Stephen. She probably never understood why her boyfriend's roommate attacked her that night. And that might really be the big irony in all of this. Now, I want to be clear, I am not at all blaming Latrice in any way. She died because Robert was a shitty, controlling, violent jerk, and I'm not defending her affair. But even if Latrice was single when she and Stephen started dating and she never did anything wrong, she still could have died in this exact same way. But I do find it ironic how everyone in this story was keeping secrets from another. Latrice hid Darin from her family, and then later she hid the fact that she was cheating on Darin. Stephen apparently never told Latrice how much danger she was in just by dating him, and of course Pastor Robert was hiding his true self from the world. Everybody had their secrets. Everything was a complete unknown. And it's just so tragic that Latrice's death was the one thing that brought all of those hidden truths into the light.
Mr. Jones, that must have been a bittersweet for you. It's all right. Come on over here. You get yourself together, Mr. Jones. I know this is difficult. This is your son.
Emotionally, it's taking everything out of me. I haven't been able to sleep, to eat. It was almost like reliving a year and 8 months ago all over again. But the best thing about this is I got closure this time. There's no more waiting, no more wondering. Now I know. Maybe now. We can go on with our life and try and get our lives back together. The emotions, just the last 2 weeks, it's just been it's unexplainable. It's unexplainable, but I tell you, I cried, but they tears of joy, man. And I just don't know.
His attorney tried to plant doubt in jurors' minds.
He did.
And he may have. I mean, we've talked to some of the jurors. They wanted to be sure they didn't convict the wrong man.
This is true.
Were you?
Never doubt in my mind, though. No doubt whatsoever. And I was here from the day that it started, from the jury selection up to right now, and was determined that I was going to be here regardless, because this man is a predator. This man, why he's been here this long without, I have no idea. I mean, in just the last part of of Mr. Cummins, of what he told us, you know, that's things we didn't even know. And I think that if they would have known that in the beginning, it wouldn't have took this long to convict this man.
What were your thoughts as he was led away today?
Goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your life. Because, you know, he was tried for one murder, but he actually killed 3 or 4 of us because he killed my daughter, he killed my family, and he really killed himself. So he has no life either. And that's exactly how I wanted to be with him. Now, I'm not a man of hatred, but this man really took something very precious away from us.
Now, I'll be honest with you guys. When I first started researching this case and putting together the episode, I thought that this was going to go a very different way. Let me know in the comments if you thought that too toward the beginning of this episode. But in everything I read, all of the research, there was such an emphasis on her relationship with her family, specifically how close she was with her dad, how she was a daddy's girl, all of these things. And that was a highlight point in all of the articles. So before I got to Robert and what the truth really was, I definitely thought this was going a different way. That like she had kept this secret from her family. She kept Darin a secret, maybe because she didn't want her dad to get outraged since he was so strict and because they were very, very close, and then maybe he retaliated. I mean, I don't know. My mind was going somewhere else as I was researching this, and then I was very, very relieved to find that it wasn't somebody close to her. Not that it should have happened at all, but I'm curious to know your thoughts if you thought this was going to go a different direction as well. So let me know in the comments. In any event, thank you for listening to Latrice's story today, and I appreciate you sticking through it. I know it was a long one, so thanks for watching. Don't forget, on your way out, take a quick second, hit the subscribe button. It's totally free. It's just a way to support the channel, and that way you also won't miss any future episodes as I post them. All right, guys, thanks again, and until the next case, stay safe. Bye.